Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden, an author of over 30 published novels and a ninth grade English teacher. And I am so excited on this episode to have Deborah Jackson Taffa with us. Her book is Whiskey Tender, and I am just thrilled that I got the opportunity to read it because it has just been eye-opening, and especially for this area in northern New Mexico and the Four Corners. Deborah, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Thank you so much for having me today. I am Deborah Jackson Taffa, and I come from the state of New Mexico. My mother was born and raised in Socorro, New Mexico, and my father is a descendant of Laguna Pueblo. His mother is from Poati there, and I grew up in Farmington, and it's nice to be speaking with someone from San Juan College. I have great memories of taking a painting class there at some point. I think I was probably in my late teens. Just thought it was a great community. So thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to have you. And Deborah, give our listeners who may not have heard about Whiskey Tender yet, kind of give them an idea of what is the premise of the book. This is a memoir, and what you cover and some of the themes and topics you touch on, and then we'll dive into it a little bit more after that.
It's a classic coming-of-age story, right? It starts in my youngest childhood and takes me to a few days post-high school graduation at Farmington High, and tells the story, which some people might find counterintuitive, of a mixed tribe indigenous girl who is having somewhat of an immigration experience, right? So we left the reservation when I was 7 years old. And of course, Indian nations, the United States, are considered sovereign nations. It's a world unto its own, very particular in its culture and its people. We kind of left there because my father went through a program called the Indian Relocation Program that was run by the federal government. And it meant that we moved into mainstream America. And it's about my childhood in the 1970s and 80s. People will recognize like the music references and the pop cultural references, the television shows and prom and all of the things that happen to a kid growing up in that era. But then it also kind of tackles what it feels like to be from an indigenous, to be an enrolled citizen in a tribal nation and to have to learn how to balance sort of your aspirations for the American dream with sort of the idea that you have been dismissed and wounded by the federal government in so many different ways. And I guess the backbone of the story is my father, he's just a character. To this day, he's just this amazing character. He's very fun-loving, and he's very aspirational, and he believes very much that me and my sisters can grow up and be anything we want to be. And so him and my mother put a lot of pressure on us to kind of excel in school, and it becomes somewhat of a burden for us, I think. They're very much like do as we say, not as we did, because neither of them finished high school. And so they want us to be very high achieving, and they come from very talented families, but they had kind of rough childhoods themselves. And it's a family story, it's a family story. It's a love story. It's very tender, even as it shows dysfunction. And I think it also weaves in quite a bit of hidden American histories that many people will be surprised to read about.
Absolutely. And that was something, reading this, I've lived in the Four Corners all my life, most of that here in San Juan County. And there was a lot that you bring up and cover that I really was not aware of. I'm definitely aware there is still racism in this area, and it's something that I think hopefully is getting better, and
Right.
not seeing quite some of the experiences to the level that you described in certain parts of the book. Thankfully, that's not an everyday occurrence anymore.
Yeah.
But
yes.
Definitely still more progress to be made in that area here. But even with just a lot of the history that you bring up and how the town politics were operating and what was allowed and not allowed. And there was a lot of that history that, that's not coming into schools. That's not openly discussed. And it's kind of in the memory of people who experienced it, but it's largely stayed there.
Yeah. I tried very much when I wrote the book to make it engaging, and there's dark humor, and it's a quick read. It kind of draws people through. It's definitely built on a plot of this kid coming of age. But then I also wanted to I wanted to scope in and include like regional histories and kind of scope out and include like larger federal histories and American histories, all in the way that they affected my family. So kind of some of the histories that are woven in that people will be surprised to learn about involve something called the Major Crimes Act or the Indian Relocation Program. There are the largest open pit uranium mine in the country is outside of Laguna. There's sort of some World War II histories, and there's the history of the birth of the American Indian movement during the Civil Rights era. And it was really an interesting balancing act because I wanted it to be a commercial nonfiction book. And at the same time, I wanted to kind of sneak in some of the more intellectual content that I thought readers might find enjoyable. And so there was kind of a constant tug of war between those two things. A lot of people can identify with at the same time that I'm somewhat educating people. And I was really pleased. I don't know if you know that Oprah Daily named it one of the top 5 memoirs of the year so far. The review that they wrote about it was that it is a book that is about no less than the birth of a nation, which makes me really happy because it means that I achieved sort of the really microscopic look at this kid who is playing England in her school play, and she wants to have a dog, and she has these kind of funny things that happen to her at the same time that I'm able to kind of address larger American thematic issues like large scale. I feel like I succeeded in doing that. It makes me really happy. So it's not all negative about Farmington. You know, we had a lot of really nice girlfriends that we played softball with, and I had some great teachers, but it definitely does sort of portray what it was like back then in the 80s when I was pretty lonely because, you know, Farmington is a majority Dene or Navajo population when it comes to the native people. And because my mother is Chicana and my father is Laguna Pueblo and Yuma Quetzan, I was kind of a minority Indian in an Indian majority of Navajo people who didn't always recognize me or see me as being native because I was somewhat white presenting. So it was just a really confusing time. And ultimately, I hope it's a reclamation sort of the pride I have in being Indigenous and the pride I have in Indigenous value. It's a rediscovering of my roots that I feel like the book ultimately lands on that makes me feel really happy when I share it out in the world because it's a really beautiful culture that I come from. And sometimes we dwell on the dark side of it. And there are a lot of positive aspects to being Indigenous in America today.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought that up and the blending that you did. 'Cause that was something when I first started reading that I noticed right off the bat. That's a little bit of a different structure because you're bringing the story as well as the history, and they went together really seamlessly. And like I said, even though I've lived here for so long, there was a lot of the history that I didn't know very well. Like maybe I'd kind of heard. I knew what the Relocation Act was. I was somewhat familiar with it, but actually being able to really see the experiences and the effect that it had on families. And you bring into it some members of your family who felt that they were benefited by it, and then some where they struggled more with that idea and with leaving. Yeah, and just how that is experienced so differently depending on the situation and the people involved and the outcomes as well.
Yeah. Oh, that makes me so happy that you read it that way. I do think, you know, everyone has an individual relationship with how they're going to react to something like the Indian Relocation Program. Some Native people don't want to leave the reservation. My father very much wanted to get me and my sisters ahead in life, you know, and he didn't want us to grow up as impoverished as he had. My dad is one of 10 children and my mother is one of 15. So they both grew up wanting, you know, they didn't always have enough food and they didn't always have warm clothes. And I think that he was intent on making sacrifices for us so that we could achieve more in our lifetime, go to college, become adults who had children who were able to have a middle class life. And as a kid, I questioned a lot of the decisions that my parents made. And as I got older, I came more and more to appreciate how difficult those decisions were. It's never easy to be mobile and to leave a hometown or a home reservation or beloved family members behind. And I think we all do it more and more because it's become much harder in this country to make a living and to find your way. And I mean, I really shudder to think if my father and my mother had not made that decision where I would be today. They changed my life. in a very positive way. So, but I like that you noticed that characters in the book, siblings in the book, my dad and his brothers, or me and my sisters, we're all reacting to the American experiment and the idea of forced assimilation in different ways. And that's the way it should be. I mean, there are many ways to live your life, and I show my family both at odds and supportive of each other. I feel like I hope in a way that's very truthful. It's hard to write memoir. I mean, you're revealing things about people that you love. It's quite scary.
I imagine. Yeah, I feel like that process would be very intimidating. And a hard thing to approach of like, how do I, find just that right balance of being honest, but being respectful that this is also other people's story as well.
Yeah. In Native country especially, I feel like we've always been very worried about appropriation, and we're kind of private as people. We keep things in the family. And so it felt somewhat taboo to say I'm going to write a memoir. And I was very lucky that my father was not at all intimidated by the idea of me telling his childhood story, which involves the police. And, he got in trouble with the law a few times. And then, he went on to become a welder, and he worked at the Four Corners power plant out by Fruitland water flow for a very long time and became a foreman. And my mother's story and my sister's stories. I think in the end, you kind of land on trying to make fun of yourself a bit more than you do anyone else. And you try to reveal a bit more about yourself than you would anyone else. And looking back on having written the book now, I think, wow, I told stories, very intimate stories about myself that when I was in my 20s, I would have never imagined having the sort of courage or the grace to tell. But as I grew older and the longer I worked on the book, and I worked on the book for 10 years, a little longer than 10 years, you rework the scenes over and over, and you find the imagery that you enjoy, and you find some lines that make you laugh, and suddenly you've taken a really bad memory and you've spun it into something that's artful, that makes you smile, that makes you feel good. And so it was just a hugely cathartic experience for me in the end to share some of those memories that felt so humiliating when I was young. Which is so crazy.
Someone I was talking to a few interviews back who has some memoir that mentioned just that distance of time and how that changed her ability to put those experiences into words and be able to process it in a different way through writing that maybe wasn't something she was able to do when she was closer to that moment.
Oh, that makes me feel good that other people have that experience as well. I do believe that art is a really nice way to sort of survive in the world. I think that for me, sitting in my office, I like writing sentences. I like making them lyric, and I enjoy creating imagery. And for me, it has been a way of processing and coming to accept my lot in life in this world. And it's just been such a wonderful experience to have the book out and to see how it's affecting people. I've done so many readings on my book tour in the last 6 weeks, and in nearly every audience, there's a young Indigenous person who has been very moved by the story. So that was the goal, was to leave a map for Indigenous kids to kind of figure out how they could survive, because it's pretty confusing to grow up Indigenous in this country. On one hand, you kind of see that from state names like Iowa to football mascots to like the land of butter that you see in grocery stores with the Indian maiden, it's like we're everywhere. We're ubiquitous in society. But then when you go to school, oftentimes talked about as if your people are an anachronism of time, that they were vanquished and that they don't exist anymore, and at least not in the way that they used to. And so, one of the things that was really painful for me in high school was that when we talked about my ancestors, it was always in context of the way that they were destroyed and the way that they were defeated and the way that they were defeated by the U.S. government, rather than talking about some of the great accomplishments that they had made, for example, at Chaco Canyon, like grand architectural accomplishments or botanical accomplishments in creating corn out of a grass and a flower, or the astronomical feats that they, kind of were able to make discoveries about how to build things on moon cycles and sun cycles. Like none of that is taught in schools. And so as a child, you come away not having a lot to be proud of. And it's a grand shame that there are Indigenous kids that feel ashamed of their inheritance rather than proud of it. When you give people something to be proud of in themselves, I feel like you have well-adjusted citizens who can contribute to society in a more profound way.
Well, and I think that that's something that struck me reading this, your experience of being in school, not having your heritage represented and not seeing yourself in most of what you were reading and learning about. It kind of took me to my own teaching experience. This is the first year I've taught public high school. It's kind of, they're like, here's the software we use, and here's what we have in the book library, and choose what you're going to use. And, you're kind of like, okay. And then I start looking through it, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of not quite as expansive as I was hoping it would be. And, because I have such a diverse student population between Hispanic and Native and Anglo. Right. And I've been collecting books from these interviews and adding them to my school library because I've actually been able to interact with and meet more Native authors who are telling stories about their culture and their heritage because they're not in our curriculum. I have to go outside of it and try and introduce them to N. Scott Momaday, and they're like, oh, this is who? I'm like, okay, this is an important writer in our area, let alone everywhere. Yeah.
I know. Yeah,
we
that's
should
so
know
important.
who he is. And that's something I've really been trying to make an effort to find more books and include them because I see that in my students' responses that they're not seeing themselves represented. They're not making the same connections all the time because it's like, that's not how I've grown up. That's not what my family is like. And hopefully I can keep building more of that. But that was something that struck me reading your book of just, that's something that really affects a young person, I think, especially to not feel like you're seen by the wider world.
It is so sad, yeah. I mean, we have Reservation Dogs now on television in Rutherford Falls. There are shows that are starting to emerge. And, we have more people now who are publishing books about Native fiction. We don't have very many Native memoirs. There has never been a coming-of-age memoir about the 1970s and 1980s written by a Native woman. I felt like I tried to write the book that didn't exist on the shelf. And I think the word that I always use when I talk about what literature does for us is empathy. When you hear someone else's story, it creates empathy in you, especially if they're heartfelt and they're vulnerable and they're willing to be open to say what happened and how it made them feel. There's an author that I worked with in Santa Fe, at the Santa Fe International Literary Festival. I interviewed him. His name is Colin McCann. He's from Ireland, and he saw his entire life the schism there between the Catholics and the Protestants and the infighting, and he thought that he would go around the world to communities where there was strife and bring young children together, high school kids, where one told his story to someone who was kind of from an opposing culture, and then the other tells his story back, and then they come back to the large group, and they try to portray the other's story as if it belongs to themselves, to the group. They ultimately leave with fast friendships, and I see that too in my workshops at the Institute of American Indian Arts where I teach. When you bring people together in a workshop and people are writing memoir and they're telling heartfelt stories from their past, you immediately create a bond between the students that is very meaningful, because I think we go around in society and we talk about our lives at a surface level that has to do with career or money or like the busyness of everyday life or the weather or whatever. We don't typically talk to other people in a way that has a lot of depth and meaning and vulnerability. And so that's what literature does. If you present a class with a book and the author has been successful in really exposing some of their wounds and what it means, I always say that a great memoir tells what happened, but a really great memoir tells what happened and how society pressured that person and made them develop their character and who they were and everything in sort of a pressurized, I have to respond to what the world is doing to me. None of us are born into a vacuum. And so we grow our character by responding to external stimuli. And that's what an author does. It shows cause. A writer in a story shows cause and effect, cause and effect. And by the end, you kind of can really relate to what the character has gone through. Hopefully there's a catharsis at the end of the book that makes you feel something.
I love that explanation. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier, and you kind of came back to it here, of that growing into who you are and you're developing your character and your identity. And it just happened that as I was reading Whiskey Tender, my students were doing The House on Mango Street. And
Oh yeah, Sandra Cisneros. Yeah,
such an amazing book. I could spend the entire year on that book, I think.
I love it too. It's really good. She went to the same MFA program I did in Iowa City.
That's awesome. So we're diving into her story and talking about identity and gender roles and the influences that are developing who the character Esperanza becomes. And It's been so fascinating to try to have these discussions with my students and to see so many times that they just get this look on their face like, I have never thought about that before.
Yeah,
it's like, we need to think about all these things. Like, that's why we're doing this.
Yeah, class, gender, history, it all comes together in stories, novels, memoirs. It's a great way to kind of look at a lot of different things in the life of an individual. And I know for her, the class is such a prominent thing in it. It's not just about race. It's not just about gender. It's about the poverty that she grows up with. And it's just such a beautiful, simple book. I admire people that have the courage to write in simple prose. And I was really torn about, I sold the book to HarperCollins, and it was more of a memoir, straightforward memoir. And when the editor bought it, she told me, what do you want to do in the last year that you edited? And I told her I would like to weave in more of the hidden histories and the government's policies in the way they've affected my family, but I don't want it to become too dry or like a nonfiction tome that is just dull. So please help me that I don't digress so far in the direction of history that it loses sort of the fun that it has, and people lose the narrative arc and they don't feel connected to this child anymore. And she told me she would promise to help me do that, and we went forward and did it. Yeah, Sandra's book is so thin and elliptical and just really heartfelt, and I love it so much. It's an incredible work of art.
It really is. It's so small. It looks like it's going to be a quick, easy read. And then you're like, I need to go back and read this 10 more times so I can get all of it processed. And that was a similar feeling I had with reading Whiskey Tender, of just being fascinated with the story you were telling, but then so many times kind of pausing and needing to stop and think, wait, I need to go back to that. I want to know more about this program or this period and its effects on people. And it really just had so many layers that made me stop and think about my own history and how I've developed as a person and those individual elements that all kind of come together. And especially teaching this year and having so many Native American and Hispanic students in this area where it's very diverse, but it's also very difficult to navigate that diversity.
Yeah, I think that a lot of Americans think of American history as being founded at Plymouth Rock, and there's like this east to west migration, manifest destiny. And New Mexico's history is just so different than that. We have Juan de Oñate coming up out of Mexico, and it's really important, I think, for local kids who grew up here in the state to see themselves and to understand where they stand in American history and how it's slightly different than it is in other regions, and to give them some pride in where they came from and how their ancestors arrived here, So I'm so happy that you enjoyed the book and that you're sharing it with your class, because I do think that as I wrote the book, if I had an audience that I kept thinking of as I wrote it, it really was, about Indigenous and Chicano futures and how our kids come to see themselves as New Mexicans in the larger picture of American society. So it just thrills me. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad I was able to have the opportunity to read it, and I'm already kind of like building plans for next year.
Well, let me know and I'll come and visit. I would love to come and visit your class via Zoom, I'm just in Santa Fe, so it would be wonderful to come and see you.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Well, I am going to pitch it to our administration and try to get that all figured out, because, this was just one that I just thought my students, I think, would really connect with this and give them a sense of, you're not the only one who's still dealing with this and finding some connection there.
Yeah, also, I really wanted to overturn so many of the stereotypes that people have. A lot of our literature has like the commodity cheese, and there's like an absent parent, and there's a lot of poverty. And That was never my experience amongst my Native friends growing up. A lot of us had fathers who worked very hard, who worked 3 jobs, like my dad coached softball teams and volunteered at our church. And I know so many professional Indigenous women who are my age, who are lawyers and professors and business owners, librarians. They're out there doing work in their field, and we never see sort of a middle-class representation in very rarely do we see a middle-class representation in our literature. Yet a lot of your students, they come from those families with hardworking parents. It's kind of like a way that I have tried to upend the tired tropes of what an Indigenous family looks like in this country. And I hope that a lot of the kids see it and then they realize that they can aspire to achievements in academia and in the world of business and however they want, because they have a model for it via stories that exist out in the world.
I mean, I think that's such a hard thing we've been seeing in our school this year of just that motivation for students, that they're not seeing the path forward a lot of the time. And that just made me think like, yeah, if they're not seeing those examples in their community clearly enough, then, how can we add to that and give more representation of, no, this is absolutely possible. You can take whatever path you want and you're going to be supported. And we want this for you so much.
Right. I relate to them so much because I really disidentified with the goal of academia for a very long time. I didn't get my undergraduate degree until I was 35 years old. It took me a long time because I was very angry at the educational system. I didn't have teachers like you who cared about bringing in books like Whiskey Tender or like Sandra Cisneros or like N. Scott Momaday. They brought in the typical European slant and it made me feel invisible. I mean, you're making a huge difference in the world by being the teacher that you are, and I'm just very grateful that you're there in Farmington and you're doing this.
Hopefully it's helping and some of my students are learning things and enjoying it on that day-to-day basis.
You're like, You sound very passionate and educated about what you're doing, so I imagine that you're changing lives. It's a wonderful thing. It's so important. So what age bracket are you teaching again?
I'm teaching 9th grade.
Okay, yeah, that's a rough time.
It's been a tough transition for some of them trying to move from that middle school mindset. This matters. Like, this is on your permanent record now. Let's get going. Some of them it's taken a little bit longer, but vast improvement this semester from last semester, so I'm holding on to that. I think most of them will get there and they'll get it figured out.
All right. Well, one of the major themes in my book that I'm sure you saw was an education. How to get an education in a school district that maybe makes you feel forgotten, or your culture is being snubbed by your teachers and you're not learning anything that feels applicable to your life or that reflects you and your family. I feel like speaking to you it's very affirming that you like the book and that you see in the book something that might help our youth, because I hate to see them not achieving and thinking that they can't achieve. And I do believe that if in the book, I say that the high school in Yuma, their mascot is the criminals. That's just like a true story to this day. They're the Yuma criminals. And it's like, what are you teaching children to aspire to? Or what are they thinking they're capable of when they're wearing a jersey that has the criminals on it? There's a glorification of kind of a rebellion against the state and the police, which is very vogue right now as well. And anger can be a functional thing. Anger can be something that propels you forward in life, but you need to make smart choices and know how to channel it in directions that help you rather than hurt you. And hopefully the book portrays that. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Well, thank you. And I don't want to take up your whole time. I could probably spend just a whole evening talking to you about this.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
The book's called Whiskey Tender by Deborah Jackson Taffa. And Deborah, where can they find you and find the book?
Well, I love collected works, but there's Maria's Bookshop in Durango, Colorado, Amy's. And you can always go to the library to read it if you can't afford to buy it. You can ask bookstores to purchase a copy, but it has been reviewed very well in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Esquire, Elle, Oprah, like I said. It should be just about anywhere you look for it.
Thank you again so much for taking the time to chat with me. I loved the book, loved having the opportunity to talk with you as well.
Thank you so much.
Time is precious, and so are our pets. So time with our pets is extra precious. That's why we started Dutch. Dutch provides 24/7 access to licensed vets with unlimited virtual visits and follow-ups for up to 5 pets. You can message a vet at any time and schedule a video visit the same day. Our vets can even prescribe medication for many ailments, and shipping is always free. With Dutch, you'll get more time with your pets and year-round peace of mind when it comes to their vet care.